Chris, I think you had a 44-year career in the BBC, which is pretty good going. And you started right at the heart of things in BH. But what did you bring to the BBC? What did you have in the way of education and so on and technical training before you joined?
I'm going to go right back, if I may do, David, to the 50s, where I lived at Gran and Grandad's house in Southall in Recreation Road. And I had these speakers on the wall. And out of the speakers came programmes like the Goons and the Archers and Take It From Here comedy. And I just was fascinated by this speaker setup. And I wanted to be the voice. You know, I wanted to be part of the loveliness of it all, really, the kindness and the entertainment and the fun. So I thought about it even at an early age, at about 5 or 6, really. And then Mum and Dad went to see Take It From Here in London, and I was so annoyed because I couldn't go. I was too young. I think you had to be 14 in those days, and I was really miffed about that. So Mum and Dad took me to London afterwards to Broadcasting House, and I trapped my finger in the doors, and my finger was bleeding. And Eamon Andrews came out, and he was a big star in those days, big personality. Doing sports coverage and things like that. Later he went on to do This Is Your Life. And he signed an autograph for me. Mum and Dad said, "You'll like this one, Chris." And he was Irish, and he said, he signed it Stance Christoph, which I think means good luck or something in Irish. And, that sort of spurred me on even at that age, really.
Yeah.
But I wrote to the Beeb when I was 12, and they told me to go away and get qualifications, O levels and A levels, and suggested I was thinking about maybe a tech op or something like that, and they recommended getting O's and A's in maths, physics and chemistry, which was a bit galling, really. And so I did. I went away and I wrote back again at the age of 16, and they said, well, carry on. And so that's what I took. I took maths, physics and chemistry at school, failed the chemistry but got the physics and ditched maths. But school were very good. They allowed me to nip off PE and go and help out in the visual aids department. So I was playing around with tape recorders and record players and doing hookups for the school for the summer fetes and things like that. Any recordings they wanted, they could get. And by that time, at about 1968, I'd had a reel-to-reel tape recorder, a big old Reps R30 made in Acton, at home, and I'd done lots of radio programmes on them, and I'd recorded the BBC. I loved all the music on Roundabout and things like that, and that really got me into it. And I learnt editing at school in the school play. I had no idea about chinagraphs, and I was using talcum powder to edit tape, and all that stood me in really good stead, playing in a band and doing all this visual aid stuff, that when I did apply it to become a tech op, that they were really interested. So that was my education, really, sort of doing it in an amateur sort of way, but was really serious about doing it. And I used to recall, I remember our first television set, we had an English Electric. This is in the early 60s, and we weren't rich, but Dad bought this massive telly in a big wooden cabinet, and it had an FM radio in it, so I was able to tape programmes off it. But I was able to play things through it from the tape recorder, so I could play my recordings, my radio shows as a kid, to my captive audience of Gran and my mum in the front room into the telly. That was great. That stood me in good. Silly things like that, really, that they were interested in.
So you'd been pestering the BBC in a sense, but eventually you wrote, and they presumably invited you for an interview.
Yes, and David, I can't remember anything about the interview at all, which is terrible, really. I've been racking my brains to do that. All I know is I've had this figure that they told me that they interviewed many hundreds for it, which I suspect in my head is probably not totally accurate, and took about 30 of us on there. But I don't remember anything about the interview going up to, which probably was appointments department in Portland Place. But I got through. I was absolutely delighted to hear that I was going to go to Wood Norton.
Yeah.
Straight from school at the age of 19, because I had to do an extra year at school, because I found the exams so hard. I was, technically okay, and I had the gift of the gab and everything, but academically I found it a real punishing regime, and to get in was just absolutely wonderful.
So you did the usual Wood Norton course. It's the very first thing you did. Just a lot of people started at work and then went on the course, but you did it initially, and then you were moved to Broadcasting House.
Yes, we did tape editing at Evesham, sound balancing, DJs. We played in shows. We had to make a half-hour programme in Evesham. It was called Talk Back with Evesham. We did lots of vox pops, talking to people about current issues and stuff like that. And of course, the hot topic of the day in '68 was the Catholic Church and the Pope's ruling on the pill. And I must tell you this because I don't know whether it's widely known, but if you've gone to Wood Norton, you probably would know that the technical assistants there are always building things, and they set up a pirate radio station inside BBC Wood Norton using the portable turntable and cassette decks of the day. It was a very risky venture, and they played the hit parade and stuff like that and used American Pam jingles. And if they'd been found out, they would have been, as the BBC says, terminated, probably. Their contracts would have gone, really.
So it was broadcast, it was transmitted locally, was it?
It was. You could hear it in Wood Norton around the campus. We loved it. But I really didn't have the nerve to do it myself. I thought, look, I've come this far. I've joined Artie. I've been accepted for some reason. They must like me. Don't muck it up now.
No, quite. Okay, so moving to Broadcasting House must have been really quite something.
It was, as a kid straight from school. It was overawing, really. It was mind-blowing. And I remember on the first day walking out of Mum and Dad's house in Southall and falling over on my backside on the ice. And we all laughed. Mum said, look, this is the start of your BBC career, Chris. What a way to start it. Is it all going to be like that? So we had a real laugh on the first day. But it was. We were taken to... Rosie Friend was in charge of us. She's a lovely woman, a lovely, likeable lady. And she looked after us and welcomed us all there. And we had a tour of the control room and of Broadcasting House itself, really. And it was on the first floor, and you walked down some steps, and it was like a massive sci-fi show, seeing all these banks of plugs and sockets. You could smell the air, the electricity in the air, the smell of valves and things like that, the buzz of valves. And it was a great big grey or green console. It had a telephone exchange on it, had switching to transmitters. There was the technical operations manager's office, the Tom, and there was an Atom, which we found funny, an assistant technical operations manager on his outfit there. But also around the corner was the place I worked a lot in, was the continuity suites of Radio 1, 2, 3 and 4. And that's where I really wanted to get into. And they were very kind. We all had mentors there. And we were looked after. It was like a one-to-one on training positions. And it was a really responsible job because you were switching lines to transmitters, the Droitwich long wave transmitter you had on the tips of your finger. You could turn it on and off. You could send a different feed to it, a different program to it. Not necessarily radio. Was it Radio 2 in those days? I think it was. So there was a lot of power there. I was overawed in a lot of ways as a youngster, straight from school, by just being there and the responsibility of it. You were in no doubt that whatever you did might come back and bite your bottom. They were with you and you were doing it. They would show you, show and tell, and then you'd be straight on. Like at Radio 4, for example, I remember putting the Archers on in there. Sue was looking after me. She'd been in the control room for a long, long time, probably from the 1950s. And she would say, OK, Chris, it's your turn to do that. So you steeled yourself. You got hold of this great big spool of tape with the Archers on it. You placed it on. You made sure the faders weren't open. You put your headphones in. You lined it up with a Chinograph to start it at the beginning. You moved it back. And at the right time, you opened the fader. When the continuity announcer said it's now time for the Archers, and at Ambridge today this is happening, and it was the same really with the other continuities 2, 3, and Radio 1, which I really liked, and There was one thing I never ever got the hang of, David, to be honest. In all the time I was there, it was only 3 years I was there, they had a place called Television Outside Broadcasts, and it was the OB lines that came in, for radio as well, but it was TV OBs was a massive part of it on the side.
Yes.
And on a Saturday afternoon when Grandstand was on, it was like spaghetti junction for wires. It was just completely all over the place. And I would hoped I would never be put over there. I got 1 or 2 sendings over there about under supervision and things, but to be honest, I didn't do my best, so I wasn't sent over there on my own. I don't think I could have coped with all that plugs and sockets.
Now, when you were in that control area, that area where all the knitting was, were you also talking to people in the studios, here when their programmes were coming to an end or when they were about to start or something like that? How did it work?
Yes, you'd have a line booking for the actual outside broadcast. So, say you had a line coming in from a football match, you wouldn't actually where all the spaghetti was. You actually weren't talking so much to people as you were in the continuities, but you'd have the line booking. You'd plug the line up, and they would do a test, and then you would hand it through to whichever studio it was going to. We spoke more to people when we were in the continuity suites of, say, if Radio 4 was taking any questions, and it would come through on a line through control room into Radio 4 continuity. We would then speak to any questions down the line and give them clean feed and things like that, and then hand them from Radio 4 continuity to, it would come directly through us. But if it was going to a studio in a big mix, like a sport, it could be routed through a continuity, and we would let it go and tell the studio that they could have it.
Yes, but also you were talking to whoever was directing the studio in Broadcasting House, and you would be talking to them, would you?
We would, yes, that's right, we would. They'd be up, say it was The World at One, we'd talk up to the studio from the continuity suite via a little clicker switch, talkback switch. We'd feed in the pips for The World at One. We'd give them flashes as well of red lights. We'd flash their lights from the continuity suite, from the control room in The World at One, saying we're ready to go, and then we'd give one big flash to say your fader's open, you're going out on Radio 4. So we had control of them, even though they had control of the programmes.
So there were control lights and things like that. Because I remember being at a Conservative Party conference or something like that, and seeing The World at One being done, from a desk somewhere. It all looked very sort of primitive.
Yes.
But how do you know when to start? How do you feed them with the things they've got to react to and so on? It's quite interesting.
Yes, and it kept you on your toes, really. And I'll tell you a bit later on about when things didn't go very well, if you like, in the continuity suites, because we had a lot of that. Do you want me to tell you about that now?
Of course. Disasters are always interesting.
Well, disaster strikes Radio 4 quite a few times, really, when I was there. We used to dial up the London Weather Centre for 5 to 6 in the evening. And we used to say, hello, this is Radio 4 continuity here. Are you ready to go? Who is it? Who's the weather man today or woman? And we'd make sure our clocks were in sync with each other. And I couldn't connect them. I couldn't connect them on the settings. They wouldn't come up. We had codes to put in, they're like uniselectors, and the light would come up to say it was the weather centre. I think Big Ben was D0001 or something. Anyway, I was in Radio 4. Needless to say, the announcer was getting stressed and filling like mad. And my big boss, called the technical operations manager, the Tom, was in the control room. He was on the case, and we didn't get the weather. And they had to apologise on Radio 4 for not getting the weather. And we just couldn't fathom it out because we literally couldn't get through to them. So what it turned out was there was a brand new local radio station started up called BBC Radio London, and it overran on the weather and kept it. They kept it dialed up, and they held on to the weather centre. And needless to say, there were massive memos flying around afterwards from my bosses and from the from Radio 4 presentation. They really, who were these upstarts? They said in local radio. But there was another one in Radio 4 continuity. Any Questions was on air on a Friday night, and Bruce Wyndham was the announcer in Radio 4 continuity. And he'd switched his equipment in the. I was in the control cubicle of continuity. It's 2 rooms with a bit of glass separating you in simple terms, soundproofed. So they couldn't hear me on air, but they could hear Brucey if he turned his mic on. But he turned all his gear into what they called rehearsal mode, so he could practice for his Radio 2 shows. So he was playing pop music, and suddenly, and he was bopping around a bit. He couldn't hear me trying to tell him on talkback that we'd lost Any Questions. And I was going mad. Eventually I went in there and said, Bruce, we've lost Any Questions. There's nothing I can do at the moment. We're all going frantic. Any Questions is off air. Please Phil. So he switched himself back in. He scrabbled into his cupboard. He took all his pop records off and played some rubbish on non-needle time we usually have to fill with. Incidental non-pop music, and was apologising on air about it. And it turned out that what had happened was we had no idea that a big lorry, a Pantechnicon they described it, had driven through the wires, the cables, and cut the show off air. And we got it back on air eventually, but there was another huge memo at the end.
Now, eventually you moved from Tech Ops there to really rather strange part of your career when you looked after costumes.
Oh, Gus, yes, of course you know about that. And I've kept that a secret for a while, but no, it's out in the open now. No, it's what happened was this is absolutely true. The shift work didn't agree with me at Broadcasting House, and I had something called anxiety and anxiety depression. It wasn't very nice at all, and it made me ill. And eventually I resigned. I didn't know what to do. All my colleagues were saying, look, don't be silly because you wanted to do this job all your life. Yeah. And I just said to Mum and Dad, I just can't cope with the shifts anymore. I wasn't sleeping. It was making me ill. And I resigned. And I thought, well, I don't want to leave. I've done something silly because I've resigned, but which was a big step for me. And I then started. I thought, well, I didn't want to resign at all. So I started reapplying for jobs, and I applied for anything that wasn't working shifts. And one of the jobs that came up was at Television Centre, and it was in costume transport. And I went in, and the lady said, well, what on earth do you want to do something like this for? And I explained exactly. I was very truthful. I explained what had happened, become ill, and I was getting better, and I wanted a day job really. And she said, well, to be honest, this is a day job with pressure, and you'll find it very interesting. And what it was an office on one of the upper floors at Telly Centre, and I was the only clerk in the costume transport department, and all the costumiers, costume people at Television Centre would write a list of the things they needed for a show like Morecambe and Wise, send a docket to me in the office, and I would have to get hold of the runners, as we called them, to go out on various forms of transport to bring them in. I never met any of the costume people or the runners. I was just in this office. And the calls that came in and things like that, and the dockets that came in, and they would literally fly off to Berman's and pick up stuff from Morecambe and Wise. There'd be the classic shows that were going on. This was in 1971. So there were quite a few big classic shows, if you look them up, in those days that were happening. And it was their responsibility to bring these costumes back for the actors to try on to use in the production. So, and it was really interesting. I really did thoroughly enjoy that. It was a great time working there. Val Middleton was the personnel officer. She said, look, I'm really sorry you're going because it's working well. It doesn't always work like that. And they had to get rings and classical costumes and small bits and pieces and fun things.
So sometimes you were chasing things that maybe got lost.
Yes. Yeah. Oh yes. It was chasing stuff all the time on the phones, and it was stressful, but in a great way. I loved it. It was really good.
And it was a very good story too. I think it's very honest of you to give that story.
Well, I think if it's about what happened, it needs to be truthful and not skirted over. And it was a horrible time to have to come out of the Beeb
Yes, sure.
and do something completely different. But it
Absolutely.
really helped.
So that gave you a sort of break. But I mean, then you went. That was your only experience with television, really, because I think otherwise you worked in radio, didn't you? Local radio.
Well, I did,
Subsequently.
and that was coming up at the end of the 70s. But during the 70s, I had lots of jobs in industry because I got a taste for doing different things when I did the BBC job. And a friend of mine was working in a television setup called Inner London Educational Television Authority in Battersea, Elia. It was in the days when the local authority in London had its own television studios. It was Clyde Martindale, who was a mate of mine, who was a tech op, said, Chris, I hear you looking around at things to do, but have you ever thought of television? And I said, well, the only experience I've had is in costume transport. He said, well, why don't you come over and help us with the sound? Apply for Elia. We've got a job coming up as a sound assistant here. So I did that and commuted to Battersea from Southall. And they were making TV programmes, a couple a day, maybe 2 or 3 a day, which was quite a lot in those days, on big videotape. And they had a couple of studios, and they were mainly ex-BBC and ITV employees who were working there like me, and out of work actors and things doing the children's television stuff. And it was great because I was able to work a boom microphone in a television studio, standing on the platform waving this big lollipop on a stick around at actors and things like that, trying not to get any boom shadow or getting it in shot. Or working the sound desks behind the glass, or even holding those rods, what do you call them, where the microphone are on, the lollipop sticks, whatever you call them, with the mics on.
Oh well, it's sort of gun mics.
Gun mics, that's it, yes, doing all that. And it was great fun, I really enjoyed that. And it was in the days before the internet and things like that. And it was all on tape. We recorded shows, and they all went out to the schools in the Inner London Education Authority area. And the school children had it part of their school's broadcasting. So I was really proud of that, and it gave me a bit of a taste of television. There's so much hanging around in TV, compared to the radio, where not when you I was hanging around in Radio 2, if you're in Radio 4, you put the Archers on and it was 20 minutes or so. But in TV, there was a lot of moving equipment and lighting. I learnt so much about how to be patient, basically, and go with the flow of making the programme and doing retakes and things like that. No disasters to mention, though.
Did you leave the BBC to work with Ilya?
I did. I'd already resigned anyway as a tech op. I'd literally shut the door because I didn't know if they'd offer me a job when I was ill or what they wanted to do. I thought the best thing to do is sort myself out and then come back. And they didn't run after me saying we've got this and that happening. The BBC didn't work like that really. It was, if he wants to go, he wants to go.
Sure.
So I did resign, and then I went back to work at the costume department, and then that was the BBC job. I suppose I had to resign again, and then I got the good offer at Elia Television. So I was completely free of the Beeb by then.
Yes, but in '79 you moved back.
Oh yes, but I came in a funny old route. I went in to get the voice right. Although I'd been working with the Radio 1 DJs and had done programmes, I never had any voice coaching and things like that, and decided during the 70s I'd get into hospital radio, and a good friend of mine was working at Radio Hillingdon at Hillingdon Hospital, and there you had your own show, and you could make your mistakes, no one cared so much, and it was great because you were one-to-oneing with people who were listening to your requests. You go up on the wards to do it properly, and talking to people who weren't very well there and trying to cheer them up by playing them their favourite music. So I did jazz shows, classicals, request programmes and stuff like that. So that helped me. And then worked for a company called Hitachi when they first moved over from Japan, and they were after people to work for them there. And I worked in their stockroom dispatch department, which meant I could compile my shows for the radio as well as working for them basically. And they sent people to Japan after 10 years of working. And I knew a few people who'd gone over to Japan to find out how they worked. And they sent people And it was amazing to see how the Japanese worked in the UK, because the lab people, scientists, there was this row of washing machines and fridges from all the other manufacturers, all in bits, in their factory, and they were taking them, and it was like an autopsy to find out how these things worked and how they could improve their products. It was an amazing insight, and I used a lot of this information in my journalist career sort of later on. I was building all this stuff up, and they were the most generous company I've ever worked for. There was Harrods hampers at Christmas when they first started, with luxury goods in it. It was just stupendous. And they were really anti-union, which was fascinating to see as well. They didn't like the system that the British worked to, that you could enjoy. Like I was in the Bectu, I think it was, or one of the unions when I was a tech op. They didn't like it because they didn't want to have industrial relations issues with unions. They wanted things their own way in a lot of ways. It's probably changed a lot now, but that was an eye-opener to see how they were. The Japanese were very friendly, and so were the Brits who worked there as well. We had a wait of a time, but then BBC was beckoning, and I was almost ready to, and I had been applying for local radio, but with no success. I thought I'd better get back into Auntie if I can do, and that's what I did.
Right, so what did you do when you went back?
I saw an advert in the paper for a technical stock keeper at Television Centre. This was in 1979. And they said, "What the hell are you doing coming in here asking for a storeman's job with a technical operations background?" And I said, "Well, it's one way I can get," was honest again, "one way I can get back into the BBC, but I know a lot about components that go into hi-fi and broadcast equipment. I've operated broadcast equipment in television and radio, and I know part of this job is to issue microphones to the studio staff and things like that. So there's lots of areas that I know, and it'll also give me time to work on my plan to get into a radio presenter's job." And they said, "Okay, all right, we'll take you on." And that's what I did for 4 years. It was brilliant. So I saw my mates at Television Centre who I'd left. They'd been on the TV course in Evesham. Well, I've been on the radio course. Alan Stokes did Last of the Summer Wine. He said, "What are you doing down here handing me out my microphones?" And I explained it. And he understood. I said, "Look, I don't want to go back to a tech op role. I've done that. I want to be the voice." And that's what I pursued throughout that 4 years. So it was great issuing the components. And as you know, Television Centre has a world within a world, or it did do when the Beeb were there. They had people selling things. There was Eric the Boot, who sold shoes. "Let me introduce you to," I said, "I need a new pair of shoes. I'm going down to Shepherd's Bush to buy a pair." They said, "There's no need. There's a man here at Television Centre who will sell you a pair of boots. His name is Eric the Boot. They're not stolen, and have a look." So I bought my shoes and trainers from Eric the Boot. And a lot of these cottage industries going on as a sideline at Television Centre, as well as the good work, serious work that we were doing.
Well, that's interesting, because I know they had barbers and things like that.
They did.
But I didn't know. Did
you never meet Eric?
Yes, I never met Eric, no. So then you decided to move on a bit, and I think you went to external services, is that right?
Oh, that wonderful. Could have stayed there the whole of my lifetime. External services programme ops, and as a gramophone assistant, note the word, the long gram, no, you couldn't use the word grams, it was a dirty word. Gramophone, even in the 80s, at Bush House. And you were issuing records to producers. The producers would come in from all the World Service sections and say, "Chris, have you got this record by the Shadows or Cliff or the Beatles? Or I'm thinking of, or even better, I'm thinking of doing this feature on so-and-so, on the sea. Could you suggest any music that will go with it, please, for the radio programme, live programme or documentary and things?" And it was amazing. I was working in an area I knew a lot about. I loved music. I've got a couple of thousand records myself by then, and I was spinning them at hospital radio and things. And I love all music, so it was just an absolute joy. And Connie, who was one of the bosses, Heather ran it, but Connie was this strange woman. We were always trying to find out. She was a mystical woman in her 50s or maybe even in her 60s when we were there. And we said, "Connie, what did you do in the war?" And she would never tell us. and it was we tried to crack her. Patrick and Martin, who were staffers there, said we've never been able to find out, but it was she did something secret in the war, Chris. So I tried to work on her a bit, chatted her up and everything, but it was no good. And later we found out that she worked at Bletchley Park.
Oh, really?
In the Code Busters, yeah. And she was sworn to secrecy. I think even in the 80s, I don't think it was terribly public knowledge. She didn't fess up. So I would love to, I don't think she's alive now, but we wanted to find out. And then when it came out that Martin and Patrick found out she'd been at Bletchley Park, we weren't surprised, because there was this air of mystery and mysticism about her. Yes. But it was a great place to work. The restaurant at Bush, as you probably know, had some nice fish tanks in, but it did food from all over the world. And I really didn't want to end that attachment. They extended it by a couple of months, but I had to go back to tech stores at Telecentre.
Now, usually, I mean, I remember as a producer, you want some music for something, but you've no idea what quite. And you're trying to get somebody to give you advice, and people in the Graham's library were very helpful. So you were actually your knowledge of music became important to you there.
It did, and it was nice to have it recognised too. If they went off very happy with a few albums and singles, it was just before CDs came out, then I was happy too, because I'd done my job, and I felt part of that programme, whether it was Outlook or whatever it was at World Service. We'd done the job, and they had a great selection of records, and they gave me records too that was surplus. That was, I remember Supertramp being out, the live album in Paris and things like that were very, very, they were kind. I didn't, the first sort of freebies from the Beeb really came from Bush House legitimately, that I was able to use myself on the hospital radio in future productions.
You had a record library at Bush House, but the main record library, the main gramophone library, was in Broadcasting House, and it was
Yes.
It was all sort of cards indexed and so on. It was quite a long time before computers could find things in a few seconds. So you had to know your way around.
Well, yes, and that did take time, because the library wasn't huge at Bush. But when the producers could order, you had the reclamations come in, but they might just turn up at the desk and ask for something quite quickly. So you had to be nimble on your toes, and think quite quickly too, and have a feel for what the programs were that they were working on, and the sort of music tolerances that they had and the audience had for it really.
So tell us some of your experiences of Radio 1.
Right, well, we had Radio 1 and Radio 2 were quite often combined there, working together in one, the two networks joined up, or Radio 1 or 2 separately. And one of the shows I used to do there, I used to work, many of them came into the continuity suites to do their programmes, and they'd self-op, which means that they'd operate the gram decks, the cart machines which played the jingles, and their microphones, and to a certain extent their microphone level themselves. We would next door at Tech Ops, we were being over all control of everything, including the limiter to the transmitter and stuff like that, and switching it in and out. And Jimmy Young would come in. He would sometimes come in late to a programme. And one day I thought I would go, and I did quite a good impression of Jimmy Young. His jingles were all out and things like that. So he came in and he caught me impersonating him in rehearsal time, in his studio chair, doing, what's the recipe for day, Jim, and things like that, and Raymondo. And I thought, oh God, what's he going to say? And the others were trying to warn me on my headphones, but as usual, I was away with the fairies and having fun. And he found it really funny. He found it very funny. He said, right, Chris, get out of my chair now, get next door, let's go. And what he would do in his rehearsal time, he would use it if he wasn't too late. He would time all his intros on his records. He was such a pro. Now, the other DJs like Wogan wouldn't do that. But Jimmy Young used to come in with his stopwatch and write them down, and he would do that. And then one day he came in, and I thought he would have to go home. He came in one day with bronchitis. He was coughing and wheezing. He was an elderly man when we were working for him. He was quite senior then, wasn't he, in the late 60s, early 70s. He wasn't a spring chicken. And he was with his girlfriend, who that time was a nurse, and she said he shouldn't be at work. And we agreed, but of course Jim is Jim, and he went on and did the show. And you managed to get through to the end. Was it 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock or something like that, really? Later on, I came in, when I was trying to push my doors through to local radio, I engineered myself to get in on the Jimmy Young show to watch it again. And who walked through the door but pre-Prime Minister's stage was Gordon Brown. And Jimmy Young liked all these politicians on his programme because it turned into a great sort of phone-in, a discussion programme, didn't it, in the end? He had Margaret Thatcher. Jimmy Young was a real Tory, and he loved having people like, although he was neutral in the BBC, he loved having people like Maggie Thatcher on. And I was there when Gordon Brown came in years later, and you could see through Gordon Brown's eyes, he loved the power of Jimmy Young and that show. So you could sense the pull that JY had on his public. And on us, we loved working with him. He was really good. Another one of the greats I worked with was with John Peel, the long-haired yobbo, really, that parents thought he wasn't anything like that. He was a kind and gentle man. And I used to work on Top Gear with him. I used to volunteer for that programme because he would have taped sessions from the BBC from Maida Vale. I didn't record them, the studio managers recorded them. Bill Sharp from Shack Attack was one of the studio managers who worked on those sessions that I found out more recently because I'm friends with Bill on Facebook. They had a hit with Nightbirds. Anyway, John Peel, he had the bands in like Led Zeppelin and Free, and we would all have a running order. I would normally want to work tapes on that programme, which sounds a bit odd, just bunging a tape on and pressing the button when he signals it to come in, because these were recorded at Maida Vale at 15 inches per second on these little cine spools. And we used to lace the tapes up. We used to start the music as close to the replay head on the tape machines as possible. And we get the engineers to tweak these massive Studer tape machines so that we could do this, so we could have a really fast start to the programme. And I've kept one of the scripts from the John Peel show. My parents in Heston in London were having a chuck out, and I rang them up just by luck one day and said, "You haven't seen my old running orders and scripts from the radio days, have you?" "Oh no, they're in the bin out the front. We've started tearing them up." And I thought, oh my God, don't do that. You know, it's the only things I've really got from Auntie as a souvenir. And rushed down to London to pick them up, and luckily only a few were torn in half, including the John Peel script. But it is a thing that I really treasure because it has all the bands that were on that show, like Led Zeppelin and Free, recorded at Maida Vale, and it makes you really, really part of that show. And during that time, I asked John Peel to sign a record. It was a record by the Cufflinks called Tracy, because my cousin had a girl born at that time called Tracy, and she asked me if as many of the Radio 1 DJs would sign this record as possible. And this was a pop record, and all the others did. Tony Blackburn, Dave Cash, Terry Wogan. And I thought, blimey, do I really ask John Peel to sign this sort of pop record, really, by the Cufflinks? And he said, "Oh, of course, bring it over here, Chris," and signed it. And it really made her day, or made her day, but she didn't know about it because she's only just born. But later on in life, the friendship of the Radio 1 DJs was all there. Yes. Including one of my favourites was John Peel. And that's the thing I wrote to the Pensioners Association about what the one thing that means a lot to the Beeb with all the memories was this script from the show that John Peel did.
Oh, that's
there we are.
Good. Yeah, absolutely. Treasured possession. But then you went to work in local radio, I think. Yeah,
I had an attachment to Radio Stoke for 5 months, and I managed to eventually blag a job after the attachment at Radio Cumbria. And I said to my wife, "Do you want to work at Radio Brighton or Radio Cumbria if I can get a permanent job?" And sod's law, they sent a Londoner 323 miles to Carlisle to work at Radio Cumbria. But we were very happy, and she was happier because before I'd applied for Radio Shetland. So we worked a lot nearer than the
Yes.
Shetland Islands. And on my first day at Radio Cumbria, I remember being sent out. They thought, we'll test this boy from the smoke out to do an interview in Windermere. The studios are in Carlisle. And so Windermere's, 30 miles, 35 miles, maybe a bit further than that. So they sent me out with my portable recorder, which was a Ewer, big heavy machine that we all used as in the radio. You probably know them. And a heavy thing, but you could do everything on them. And off I went to Windermere, to the National Park, brought back 4 minutes of audio, taking about an hour and a half, hour there, hour and a half back, turned up. And then they said, well, what have you got for us? And I said, well, I've got this interview. And they said, what, 4 minutes? Do you know how long you've been? I said, well, I've been however long it took me to get back to and from Windermere. Next time you go, bear in mind, it's taken the whole morning for you to do 4 minutes of interviewing. You're working in local radio, not network now. You knock off a few more. You think up some other stories and things. So I thought, right. So that's the way it's going to be. So that's the way it was. It was maximising what we did, making the most of time and facilities.
That's
this
interesting. Yes.
Yeah, this isn't network, running Radio 4 and what it was in those days, £7,000 an hour. This was tiny little, crumbs off the table local radio. Had to make the most of everything, really, including their staff. So
Yes.
I learned a big lesson on my first day. And they got me reading the pig prices, the farm mark prices, and they had this wonderful thing at Radio Cumbria, they've still got it, called the Lamb Bank, which is they can swap lambs over with farmers who need them to suckle with the farmers. And it was a really rural experience, even though that the station was based in Carlisle. And I was absolutely gobsmacked. This is an honest story. I went out looking, my wife was still in London, and I was trying to find out what places were like. So I had to do an interview north of Carlisle, and I've left my car. I was just about to lock my car up. I've got my trusty Ewer on my side, and someone came up and said, oh no, what are you locking that up for then? I said, well, I've come to do an interview here. You don't need to lock up your car out here. It'll be perfectly safe. And it was just a complete mindset of difference to London, where security, even in the 80s, was everyone locked everything, didn't they? You lock your front door at night. And this just was uncommon up there. Everyone was so friendly and open. Your car will be all right when you get back, so I didn't lock it up. And it was fine. And I went away and did the interview and things like that.
Yes, complete culture shock, really. Yeah.
Absolute culture shock, yes. And they got me doing everything. They got me pig prices. They got me driving the breakfast programme. And to be honest, I was very nervous. They asked me to do probably the worst thing for me to do, because it reminded me of, as it would have been in Radio 4, reading a newspaper review. I'm not good at serious things straight away in places I don't know. And they got me to read the papers review in the breakfast programme, and I was gulping. And I'd done 10 years of local radio, of hospital radio. I was confident. I'd worked in network radio, but somehow I wasn't happy doing this. And I think they felt my uncomfortableness, and they sent me out as a roving reporter, and this is more me, doing a show with a guy who's still on air now at Radio Cumbria, Joe Costin, doing the Saturday Roadshow, where we had 10 live interviews in 3.5 hours, which I had to research and do all over the county in one location. So I'd hit Whitehaven, run the cable down near the bank where the cash point machine was, so I got a captive audience to leap on to Vox Pop and things like that, and my guests would turn up there with the radio car in all weathers. It was an amazing journey. And the most bizarre studio of all was the in Workington. It was an unmanned studio. It was owned by Brian Bone, a freelance producer, but it was next to a wet fish shop, and the smell of wet fish coming up, it was just appalling. And it was the only BBC studio, it wasn't BBC owned, he owned it, was where you had to bring your own loo roll. If you forgot it, you were in trouble. So we had great fun.
Yes, I mean, you had to improvise a lot and presumably think on your feet a great deal if you were trying to get interviews when you were out on location to keep the costs down.
Yes, all the time. It was just you in the radio car, working it all by yourself and driving it. And there were big things. I had a Land Rover to start with. They tried a bit of a fun thing, not telling the engineers. They drove it up Skiddaw, nearly broke the thing. I wasn't party to that, but it was a big beast. I think the crankshaft had to be repaired. But and we used to have to take these things out, and it had a great big mast on it, like the network radio cars, 30-foot mast or whatever it was. And you had to be very careful not to set it up underneath power lines. We had to all these protect. You couldn't use it in a storm and things like that. So yeah, great fun, but serious stuff. You had to be careful taking it out. And Cumbria isn't the best weather. I had to live close to the radio station because you got in trouble if you couldn't get in during the snow.
That's very interesting. So these telescopic masts, a bit of a hazard if you put them up and you didn't know quite what was above you.
Exactly that. And also they would freeze up. So you'd have to climb on the roof of the radio car or Land Rover, with the power off, of course, and try and push the blimmin' thing down from the bottom. You could manually do it. So you didn't really want to go out in too icy weather. And of course, Cumbria is full of adverse weather that we found out when we lived there for 5 years. It's either raining, snowing, or the wind is blowing.
Now you moved back to I think Radio Leicester, didn't you, at some stage?
I did. I came very quickly. I came back. I got a call from Ken Franks, who was the Guernsey. He was ex-Radio Cumbria, and said, "Chris, have you heard about a job going at... There's a new station opening up called BBC Wiltshire Sound. It's based in Old Town in Swindon, and we'll have studios in Salisbury and maybe somewhere else." And I said, "No, I'm very happy here. People want to die in Cumbria, Ken. My wife. I've got I've got one child who's 4 and another one on the way. I'm never going to leave this place. You're going to get me out in a box. I love it. I'm presenting programs. I'm loving what I'm doing, producing program. I'm very nearly going to get the producer's job. But if you came to Wiltshire, Chris, you'd be doing something that very few people have done before. You'd be setting up a brand new local radio station. It hasn't got one. It's never had one, BBC, and you'd be setting it up. And the adverts are going in The Guardian." I said, "Oh, for goodness sake, leave me alone." And he was persistent. He rang up and said, come on, we want you. I said, "Look, you haven't even seen me down there yet, Ken. You know what I've done here, but you might not like me. The editor doesn't know me. The editor knows all about you." So anyway, I applied. I got the job, and it was amazing. Driving around the whole of my patch was North Wiltshire with a programme assistant, because I was promoted to producer, asking people what they wanted from a radio station. I'd never ever done that before, apart from in my research to get a job in local radio down in Devon and Cornwall on my own. And people were really friendly, and they say, "We want localness. We want it to be about us in Wiltshire. And, we love the outside world. We can get that on the news, but we want things very local." So I went to Malmesbury and places like that.
Yeah.
And they had like any questions session, closed doors, to find out what the listeners really want. And the editor, God bless him, shaped the station on all of that. So we had programmes like Down Wiltshire Way, which were amazing. It was shaped on Down Your Way on Radio 4. I did a programme called Family Favourites, strangely, because I used to work on that with Mike Aspel at Broadcasting House, and in hospital radio, doing it all up in the wards at Hillingdon. And it was tied in with BFBS. And it was great because my jingles would go out on BFBS, so that boosted my ego. And they would do their programme, I would do mine. And then we had a flight on Lynham, which was the local RAF station on the Hercules. And the Winco rang me up and said, "Chris, do you like French cuisine? Oh no, do you want to go on a trip for 4 days?" I said, "Oh yeah, what's that? My boss won't let me go anywhere." No, he said, "No, I think we'll be going to Cyprus." I said, "Oh." He said, "You could do some radio. You'll be able to do some radio shows and maybe a documentary." He was really selling it to me. I said, "All right." And then he rang up and said, "No, we've changed it, Chris. I've got to go to the Falklands. It's just before Christmas. I've got to take the Christmas trees over. We want you to join us. You'll be able to do several programmes there." I went in to see my boss, Tony Talmadge, and he flatly refused to let me do it. "Chris," he said, you're a great producer. We're a brand new station. We're up against huge commercial competition and competition from our own Radio 2 and Radio 4. I can't let you go. And I was crestfallen, so I reported back to David the Winco and said, look, I'm not going to be able to go. And he said, oh, that's a shame, because we could pick up some nice French cuisine in Dakar on the way down. Anyway, I rang Carol, my wife, up and said, oh, I'm not going to go on this trip. I promised them lots of radio. And then my boss, Tony Talmadge, hauled me in and said, Chris, I've changed my mind. You can go. And I could have kissed him, but I didn't. He said, I'm letting you go on these terms. I want at least 2 documentaries. You'll do a family favourites programme and another shorter programme if you can. And I can only let you go for the full for 5 days. So we went to the Falklands via Africa and Ascension, air-to-air refuelling, documentaries. It was absolutely amazing. So when I got back, just before Christmas, I worked very hard doing the programmes for the Christmas time. Flight to the Falklands went out, and they were very, very pleased with the programmes. And so was I, seeing Africa and another part of the world, really. It was, and he was the guy who designed the air-to-air refuelling, as luck would have it, and was able to talk about that during the flight. This is how it works, and this is what I devised, and told the other pilot off in front of us when we were trying to dock. He said, stop going so fast, don't do this, don't do that. It was brilliant.
And this documentary was for local radio, or did it get into the network?
No, I should have had my thinking cap on and done a network version. But I had so much to do. I don't think they could have offered it out, but it was quite localised because the crew are from Lynham and things like that. So no, what a real shame. If I'd known it was for network, I would have taken a better recorder. I took the fabulous Ewer, the half-ton break-your-back recorder, but I would have taken what they call a Nagra, which was a very expensive reel-to-reel recorder that you used in TV, and films used them to get super quality sound. It was great quality sound. They could have run it on the network, I suppose. And I'm surprised, we should have offered it to Pick of the Week or something, because, I would think it was worth it. But we didn't send it any further, unfortunately.
How do you launch a local radio station? I mean, you were there at the beginning, weren't you? When it presumably first went out.
Well, the station was off air, but was off air for a year or even 18 months, and was off for probably 6-9 months before I got there. They recruit an editor, first of all, Tony Talmadge, and they recruited what they called in those days a programme organiser, Alan Thompson, and a news editor, David Bennett. And so they had 3 people, and they had an engineer in charge, which was absolutely vital. And then they had a manager's assistant. That was the 5 or 6 in the early team. And they did some very early meetings at high level with what finding out from what the BBC required from local radio unit in London. The managing director, or whatever they call them, I forget what they call the bloke in charge. It wasn't a managing director, but whoever was in charge, Michael Barton, I think, in those days. And so it had to be set out like that. And this is my vision. And they accepted Tony Talmadge's vision of local radio. And then they went out doing what we did, canvassing the good and the great to start with, I think, and also the audience. And that's what they did for at least a year, because it's a massive patch running from Salisbury, Devizes, Marlborough, over to West Wilts, Trowbridge, where the council office is, where my friend Ken Franks, who twisted my arm so hard, became the news person over there, the news producer, because that's where all the council meetings were. So they had these key sites set up in mind. Where would the transmitters be? Who were our audience? And Tony Talmadge was formulating programmes. So that's what they would do. Then they would send the feelers out to people that they knew who thought would be good, people like me, take a risk, and then advertise in The Guardian and Ariel and things like that to recruit the staff. So there was a massive work. The building they got was already there when I got in Prospect Place, and they were already working on it when I was there, making the studios, decorating it, car park. The sign was up when I was there, BBC Wiltshire Sound in Old Town in Swindon. I mean, it was a wonderful time. The experience I just won't have again. So that's why I didn't turn it down. I said to my wife, Carol, what the hell do I do?
Okay, so day one, you're about to launch the Radio Wiltshire.
BBC Wiltshire Sound, yes.
What happened? How do you know that it was getting through? What was the reaction?
Well, we launched. Luckily, good old television came to our rescue. BBC Points West in Bristol were over. They'd done a lot of pre-publicity for us, as much as they could without getting into trouble, without just promoting us and not ignoring the commercial competition within the editorial guidelines. So we had trailers running on Points West from Bristol, and I think Southampton did stuff as well, because Salisbury was our patch there. We had test transmissions. We had It's Coming Soon, BBC Wiltshire Sound, the wonderful jingles would be going out, music was going out, the sort of music that we would be playing, aimed at the audience that we wanted. A brand new station's coming months before the station actually went on air. Countdown to the days. I mean, and they were allowed an advertising budget, so Tony Talmadge used all that for the papers and the press. You only had one shot at this, and GWR-FM, the commercial station, were mega popular. We loved their breakfast presenters. They were so good. It was a double act. They knew about sport, and they could play music. And the audience in Wiltshire had never ever had a BBC local radio station before. So when it got to the day, they hoped to have me presenting the breakfast show, but I turned them down. And I turned them down because I said to them, I'd remembered my experience in control room going back, and I said, look, I'm not very good on missing a night's sleep. I'll certainly do the breakfast show for you for a couple of weeks, but I don't want to do it permanently because my body just can't cope with missing sleep. It needs a regular day pattern. So I turned one of the best jobs down there, and they got Paul Chartner in from commercial radio, ex-BBC radio, to present the programme. 6 o'clock in the morning on launch day, all of us, BBC Wiltshire Sound, were crammed into the studios in Swindon, and Paul Chartner said, I'd like to welcome you to your brand new local radio station, BBC local radio station for Wiltshire, BBC Wiltshire Sound, and away we went with the breakfast programme with guests. But we'd had many dummy runs with the transmitters only broadcasting test music and programmes before we'd gone air. So I knew what I had to do in my job, and so did everybody else. And it ran fairly smoothly. The listeners that commented seemed to love us. We didn't have anyone saying, turn this rubbish off. They loved us. The phones lit up. The phone-ins went loopy. We were finally on air. Champagne was opened and we got on with the job, really. It was absolutely amazing.
How do you distinguish yourself from local commercial radio? What was your unique selling point, your USP as they call it?
The difference between BBC local radio and local commercial radio is that BBC is speech content led. So we're speech led. I know we play records and things like that. So we are similar to commercial radio in that sense. But we are journalistically led. And that caused me a problem, which I won't go into now, because I had to retrain as a journalist to stay there without getting sidelined in local radio. So every presenter should be a journalist, or was in those days, and probably is now. We're BJs or SBJs. Even the so-called jocks who might be freelance have news awareness and things like that. And it's run that way. So there'd be certain massive speech shoulders. There'd be a 60-40 speech to music ratio, or 70-30 in Maggie Thatcher's day to save us from the why aren't you any different from a commercial radio argument. And they maintain that. The distinctiveness. They can be local, and they are, but they're not as local as they were commercial radio, because they're allowed to, the big groups are allowed to buy them, although they do put local presenters on. So that is the big difference. It's the speech shoulder ratio to music. Do you
Very
buy
important.
that?
Yeah, I'll buy that.
Otherwise, don't close us down.
Now you went from Wiltshire though to Leicester. Is that right?
Well, it was because of this darn news business and Maggie Thatcher pressurising. Every government gets at the BBC. Margaret Thatcher is no exception, and she's very persuasive. So the BBC were very worried when she said, or her culture secretary said, what's the difference between the BBC and commercial local radio? And the BBC had to come up with a good argument because they meant absolute business. We were in no doubt we were under the worst threat we'd ever had in our lives there, our jobs and our output. And we fought a bloody battle. John Burt was the Director General, and he decreed that everybody who worked in BBC local radio had to have journalist training, was a broadcast journalist or had journalist training. So, and I hadn't, but I'd done all these programmes, documentaries, I'd read the news, I could do everything, stand on my head, play the drums. And I'd had to apply, and with the big sweep, you're having to reapply for your own job. So I did that in Wiltshire, and I didn't get it. We'd had a new manager in, he obviously didn't like what I was proposing. There was somebody cheaper, and I think they chose the second option. So I thought, what the hell am I going to do? So I'd spent time a job in radio training on attachment, and I thought, for what, I'm going to go on news conversion, as they called it, become a journalist, go up to London for 5 weeks to the training centre, and get my credentials, and then push off if necessary. So that's exactly what I did. So I went to radio training, got the journalist training. It's just a stamp to say you've got it. And more or less, my boss was pleased. And he said, I've got a job for you, Chris. I want you to be Salisbury producer. So I said, look, I'm very sorry, but I've done my placement in Leicester, and they've offered me a journalist job, and I'm going. I've said yes. I've signed. And he was shocked. They were all shocked in Wiltshire. They never thought I'd ever leave. And of course, my poor wife with 2 children had to move up to Leicester.
Up sticks again, yes, quite.
Up sticks again when the housing market had completely crashed. So, and we came up here. The BBC, in their wisdom, they didn't want to do it, but they actually bought my house in Swindon. And they only normally do that for senior managers. And my boss in Leicester said, if you don't buy Chris's house in this recession, there's something wrong with you, because he's going to lose his house in Leicester and not be able to move up. And God bless them, Gov, they did.
Really?
Yes.
First time I've heard of that. That's interesting.
And him and them, I think too. They were dead against it. The finance director didn't want to do it, but it made it so I thought, what am I going to do? Am I going to live here on my own commute? Because I don't want to go back to Wiltshire, because I'm not going to be doing the job I was doing, and I'm not having that. So as you know, probably in the BBC, they make some strange moves sometimes under pressure, and you have to be able to jump in certain directions and know what's coming. I got wind of it coming from the manager's assistant at BBC Wiltshire, said, your turn is next, because they'd already got rid of the manager and the programme organiser, and I was the next one. They had a cull of management. Hey-ho, that's what happened. So we're in Leicester. And,
that's very interesting. So just let me get this clear. The BBC buys you a house.
The BBC bought our house in Croft Road in Swindon because we couldn't sell it. Liam McCarthy, my editor at BBC Radio Leicester, said, well, when you moving up? And I said, I'm not, Liam. The mortgage, the people were moving, saying, if you don't commit soon, Chris, to this house in Leicester, it's going to fall through. So I just went into my boss's office, said, I'm not moving up, Liam. He said, what's the problem? I said, I can't sell my house. And he got straight on. He was an ex-person in control of radio training in London, so he'd been with the high flyers. He knew how the system worked. He wasn't taking anything, just pushed at us. He said, no, I want Chris. If you don't do this, I shall be really disappointed with you. And he won't, more importantly, he won't come. So they did a very hard deal, the BBC. They wanted us to sell our fireplace and fire, and I said, what are you on? Yes. Do you want to, take the floorboards if you want? It was a really tough time, but I was determined to move up here.
Well, that enabled you to move, yeah. Okay.
It did, because I didn't want the hassle in Wiltshire, and I'd been sidelined there. I wasn't taking it.
Right. So you went to Leicester, and a different sort of environment again, completely different.
Well, as soon as I arrived, the manager, Jeremy Robinson, said, would you take a pay cut? Which is unprecedented in BBC
Yes.
terms. I said, Jeremy, what are you on about? You've just hired me. He said, well, you're being hired as a senior broadcast journalist, but you're working as a broadcast journalist. I said, yeah, but you're buying all the experience of a senior broadcast journalist. So no, and he accepted it. He couldn't do much about it, but he was trying it on. And I got to know Jeremy very well. He's a lovely man, very gentle editor, but he was facing money problems, and he thought, well, maybe one of the ways is for Chris to help us out with 10 grand a year or something like that, really. It didn't work.
I was going to say, Leicester, I mean, a multicultural area and so on, completely different from Wiltshire.
What it was in the 80s. I worked in my job there. I worked on the Asian program in Wiltshire. So they did have a small Asian community. So, but like coming from Southall, being born and bred in Southall, I grew up with the Asian community, the Indian community, people from all over the world. I'm used to going to buy samosas from the shop. So it was a culture shock from Wiltshire, but in a lot of ways it was like being in a mini version of living in West London.
Yes.
So and it was great. And Vijay Sharma, who was the Asian Network, because the Asian Network used to work out of BBC Leicester. She helped me set up the Hindu program in Wiltshire. So when I got to Leicester, I said, "Oh, Vijay, it's great to see you here. Can we have chats and things like that? Can I pick your brains on programming and things like that?" So we worked very closely with the BBC Asian Network. It was a great collaborative organisation. They were on network, we were on local, and we'd swapped stories and things like that, really. So it was good. But I made a ruling to BBC Leicester. I was quite bossy by those days. You couldn't push me around too easily. And I said to them, to Jeremy Robinson, the editor, I'm only going to work here for you if you don't approach me to present programmes straight away. Because I've done that, and I've never been a hack in the newsroom for any amount of time. I've read news bulletins, I've done a week, and presented breakfast shows, but I've never read the early bulletins for months on end and gone out to do news stories endlessly. I want to immerse myself, if I can do, for a year or two as a journalist. Don't push me into presenting. And it happened. They didn't. Yeah. Until 2 years in, the lunchtime presenter went ill at 10 to 12. His show started at 12. He couldn't do the show. Jeremy popped round the corner and said, Chris, you're here. You couldn't do us a favour, could you, and present the lunchtime show? And I thought, I nearly said no, but I thought, hang on a minute. I've been here 2 years. They've been very good. They haven't pushed me into doing this before. And I said, you're in a fix? Yes. And I thoroughly enjoyed it. And that was the start of me presenting programmes again. So I got back in to my beloved radio shows through the newsroom door at Radio Leicester. But we covered everything. We covered murders, and I covered a murder, and I got a bit of TV experience covering that because we become bi-media, which meant we had to work for radio and TV, as you know, in those days. So I had to do, to a camera, report on the murder that we were covering for East Midlands Today. And I did some children in need stuff for them as well, going out with the mobile crew and reporting in. Not a lot. And I went on a mini TV conversion course run by my future editor, Kate Squire here, who was a telly person, which became, very, very useful. So the experience in Leicester was really good. Just a quick word about Bill Maynard, the naughty presenter on BBC Radio Leicester. They asked me, they wanted to shake the feathers, as my boss said, on air. And by goodness, Bill Maynard did this with his programme on a Sunday morning, because he tried to get himself into the national press on every programme, breaking political rules, breaking all sorts of rules on air. And we were on the carpet so often. But that was a good programme. The ratings went through the roof with Bill. It taught me one thing. He said to me, always do something you fear to do each day, first thing in the day, whether it is big or small, but take the smallest thing if you want to. And I've always done that. And that was really good. Ended up producing the gospel programme and the African programme. And then when Diana died 25 years ago, just like the Queen has died, sadly, quite recently, we covered the death of Princess Diana, and I was on air for 6 hours co-presenting that. And I didn't know no one knew it was going to happen. Heard our output on Radio 4 and rushed in. So it was Radio Leicester was wonderful, but redundancy was offered and taken on the last day of it being offered. Took the money and run, and have been retired for 10 years allegedly.
That's a very long career, actually.
It is a long career. It's broken up by real things. The thing I like about it, David, really was, and I'm not criticising friends and colleagues who've been in the BBC a long time and didn't do anything else, but my health broke down when I was a technical operator, and I had to do something else. And luckily that something else was working outside. And when I came back to the Beeb to present and do things, it made me a much more understanding sort of person, worldly aware, because I'd done some of the jobs that the people who I was interviewing with had done. So I was like them in a lot of ways, really, and not just... I would have been all right being BBC through and through, and I loved Auntie, I still do, but it helped greatly, really.
So it's give you empathy, I suppose, really.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, and not just surrounded and coveted and looked after by a big warm blanket, although it hasn't been that warm over the recent years, I don't think.
No. Well, no, absolutely. It's going to get a bit colder soon. Look, yes. Chris, thank you very much for doing this. That's a very interesting interview with lots of very nice little stories in it and some insights too.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.